This is Advocacy and Lobbying for Nonprofits. We're so grateful to welcome some amazing facilitators today for this event, and so grateful to you all for joining us. My name is Kinsey Keck. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with brown hair. It's pulled back in a ponytail today. I am wearing some large round wire-framed glasses and a very cozy cream and brown sweater. And I am sitting in my home office / kitchen. So you can see a white wall behind me with some artwork and then a little dining table behind me as well. I'm also the programs director here at the Roundtable. For those who don't know, the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable is a grassroots service organization that works to improve and advance the state of arts education through professional development, advocacy, and online resources and platforms to connect the arts education field. Although we're currently meeting via an online platform, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, or the place that is widely known as New York City, exists on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. We would like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black and immigrant communities, which have helped build the city that we know today. As we recognize that all of our pasts, presents, and futures are intertwined, we would like to lift up just a handful of contemporary Indigenous arts organizations that we can all support and learn from. So I just dropped those in the chat. I highly recommend saving those links, checking these organizations out, supporting them however you can with donations if you can. And I also welcome you to share any other organizations that you would like to uplift in the chat as well for those of us present on the call today. Thank you. If you are having any trouble with Zoom today, please send me, Kinsey, a private message. I am here to help. Just a reminder to please make sure that your mic is on mute when you aren't speaking so we can all hear each other clearly. We do encourage you to use the chat to connect with other folks on the call and to put all of your questions for our facilitators. We will have time for Q&A at the end of today's event. So I'll be collecting your questions for that. I also want to share that this call does include closed captioning. To activate your captions, find the captions button is either on your toolbar or in that More 3 buttons, and then you can select captions and show captions from there. And lastly, the session is being recorded and will be shared with registrants in the weeks coming after the live event. So look for that as well. Since you registered, you will be receiving that. No need to request it. And that is it for me. Before we really get started, I just want to turn it over to Patricia Wong from New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, who we're partnering with on this event, to say a few words.
Thank you, Kinsey, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Patricia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the program associate for the Pro Bono Clearinghouse at New York Lawyers for Public Interest. We are a civil rights nonprofit that works in a range of different practice areas, including a commitment to strengthening the nonprofit community by providing resources, building capacity, and connecting nonprofit leaders to pro bono legal aid. Feel free to reach out to me if your organization has any legal needs related to today's topic or on any other issue. We're here to help. A warm thank you to Kim and Kinsey from the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable for their partnership in coordinating this workshop. And also an endless thanks to our expert attorneys, Kevin Rowe and Noelle Lee from the law firm Simpson Thatcher and Bartlett. Kevin Rowe is a counsel in the firm's exempt organization practice, and Noelle Lee is an associate in the firm's exempt organization practice. We thank them for sharing their time and expertise with us this afternoon. With that, I will turn it over to Kevin and Noelle to begin the workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinsey. Thank you, Patricia. And thanks to everyone for joining us here today. Just to set a little bit of expectations around what we're going to do today. This training was requested, I think, primarily with an idea towards lobbying and advocacy around particular issues. We are going to cover what we call the political campaign intervention rules. Because both of those rules affect how you interact with public officials and will be helpful to, in some ways, you need to almost check the political campaign activity rules off to start to understand what is and isn't lobbying and make sure we have that distinction straight in our heads. So We have a fair amount of content to cover today. We're going to try to go a little bit quickly, particularly through the campaign intervention piece, with an eye towards leaving a robust amount of time for questions at the end. As you have questions while we speak, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Noelle and I will do our best to keep sort of half an eye on that and try to address questions as we go through. But to the extent we're not able to hit them fluidly as we talk through the content, Kenzie is collecting them, and we can address ones that came up and didn't get answered at the end. So with that, I think we want to jump right in. So there are lots of laws and different legal regimes that govern what I'll broadly call nonprofit advocacy and set kind of permissible boundaries and lines for what 501c3 organizations can do. Today, we are focusing on one of those specifically. Those are the restrictions imposed by the federal tax laws that establish exemption for 501c3 organizations and establish the permitted amount of lobbying activity and the permitted amount of political campaign intervention, which that latter amount is 0, as we'll talk about in a moment, in order to obtain and maintain tax exemption under Section 501c3. There are a few other regimes. Sorry, no, let's just stay on the prior slide for a moment. There are a few other regimes that you should be aware of, but that we are not going to talk about in any detail today. Just quickly, those are federal campaign finance laws, which govern, contributions to political campaigns, again, not permitted by 501c3s. There are also federal and state lobbying disclosure laws. So to the extent you are engaged in communications with public officials about legislation or about regulations, those communications may require your organization to register and report under those regimes. We will provide you with some links to resources at the end of this presentation to learn more about those requirements. And then there are comparable, again, state campaign finance laws. There are also, and we'll touch on this very briefly at the end, rules around gift acceptance by public officials. But let's jump right into the federal tax rules that we're going to discuss today. And I say before anybody goes running for the hills, these are federal tax rules in the sense that they're contained in the tax code. We're not going to talk about any kind of federal income tax calculations today. No math today. I do always like to start with this cartoon, which is just to head off at the pass what I am going to be doing a fair bit through this presentation and what Noelle will be doing as well, which will say, the answer here depends on all of the facts and circumstances. And so there is a fair amount of this where it is going to depend and going to require some detailed inquiry in order to be able to answer with certainty whether something is or is not lobbying. What we want to equip you with today is really two things. One is a sense of the scope of what your organizations, what 501c3 organizations generally are permitted to do, and enough of an understanding of the underlying definitions for you to, in some cases where it's clear, understand for yourselves whether something is or isn't lobbying or isn't political campaign intervention. And where you may not be able to answer that question yourself, at least what we lawyers call issue spot. Recognize situations where you may want to seek some additional guidance on whether a particular activity is or isn't permissible, or whether the scope of it may need to be limited in some way. All right, so as promised, we're going to start with political campaign activity. So all code section 501c3 organizations, which I am going to, sorry, apologies, a quick intervention from the official presentation dog with me for just a second. Sorry about that. Code section 501c3 organizations, which I'm going to loosely refer to as charities during this presentation, are prohibited from directly or indirectly participating or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. That is a mouthful, but it is a long way of saying that you are not permitted to intervene in elections, to make efforts to get one particular candidate elected over another, or to defeat the campaign of any particular candidate for office. These rules are sometimes called the electioneering rules. Electioneering and political campaign intervention are generally used synonymously. I will use them synonymously. Sorry, let's stay on the prior slide for just a moment. Who is a candidate for public office? A candidate for public office is any individual who offers themselves up as a contestant for public office. Importantly, I want to emphasize that a candidate does not have to be someone who is registered with the FEC. So a presumptive candidate who everyone expects to run for office, whether it was Hillary Clinton in 2016 or Donald Trump in 2024, if they are presumptively expected to run, you should treat them as a candidate, even if they have not, for official technical political campaign finance rules purposes, declared themselves as a candidate for office. We've spelled out some activities here that constitute campaign intervention. Campaign intervention, I think, is relatively intuitive, and they include both public statements that you make, as well as any kind of direct expenditures in support of or in opposition to a candidate for office. So these rules do not prohibit 501c3 organizations from conducting voter education activities, including the presentation of public forums and the publication of voter education guides. They do not prohibit voter registration or get out the vote activities, but all of those permitted activities must be conducted in a nonpartisan manner, in a way that does not favor one candidate over another. One place where we particularly caution folks is voter education guides truly need to be nonpartisan and information-based. They shouldn't provide a grading or ranking of candidates based on the particular issue that the voter education guide is focused on. So with that, Noelle is going to speak a little bit to candidate appearances.
Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, another type of activity that charities are not necessarily prohibited from engaging in would be candidate appearances. So, a charity, for any number of reasons, might want a political candidate to appear or to speak at an event that it is hosting, whether because the candidate currently or previously held a public office, has some kind of subject matter expertise, just has had a very distinguished career, or simply by virtue of the candidate being a public figure or even a member of the public, if this is an event that is open to the public. And just because a candidate for public office is present at a charity-sponsored event does not mean that that charity is automatically engaging in political campaign activities. As Kevin kind of previewed, this is going to be a common refrain throughout the presentation, but whether or not presence at a charity-sponsored event rises to the level of political campaign intervention is going to be a facts and circumstances inquiry. So, some factors that you might want to consider as a charity, especially if you're inviting a political candidate to speak, or if you intend to kind of publicly recognize the candidate at the event, include, if the candidate has been invited to speak solely for reasons unrelated to their candidacy, whether the candidate and any charity representative, for example, the moderator of a discussion, intends to mention the candidate's political campaign or the ongoing election, whether any kind of campaign activity occurs sort of in connection with the candidate's attendance. So thinking about the communications between the public charity and the candidate leading up to the event, any kind of event publicity, do those communications kind of clearly state the terms or the capacity in which the candidate is appearing at the event? Is, again, the candidate's campaign or the election mentioned in these communications? And then finally, a charity might want to consider, if it's maintaining a non-partisan sort of atmosphere at the event during the premises, on the premises during the event. This might include thinking about, what would the responses be if any kind of partisan speech or political speech were to occur at the event. This is kind of a recap of things to think about when you're considering inviting political invited to speak or attend. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Kevin.
Yep, thank you. Noah, let's stay on the prior slide for just 1 second. I just wanted to add a couple of things because we got a specific question actually prior to today's session that you're interested in hearing about whether it would be permissible to invite a government representative to a free school performance gala or other arts event supported by your organizations. So the answer is yes. I think focus on one thing Noelle said on the prior slide of you are inviting them in a non-candidate capacity. So you're not inviting, you know, the miscellaneous candidate for public office who you want to win. You are inviting, I think in that hypothetical, you would be inviting the existing office holder in your district, right? Because you have an interest in showing them the work that you're doing, educating them about the community. That's fully appropriate. If you wanted to invite candidate, if there is not a sitting office holder and there's an event happening in advance of an election, I think it would be appropriate to invite all candidates for an office if that's what you all wanted to do. In terms of their speaking at any event, Noelle laid out the kind of key steps to take. And what I always, I think, want to, relieve folks on here a little bit is there's no legal obligation to run up onto the stage and tackle a city council member if, despite your best intentions prior to the event, to inform them that it's a nonpartisan event where they should not give their stump speech, run up, snap the mic out of their hands. We appreciate the dynamics at play here, and that office holders are sometimes less, may not take direction as well as you want them to do in those cases. I think the best thing you can do is establish a clear record of communication beforehand, have emails to them where you communicate the nonpartisan nature of the event, ask them to refrain from partisan speech at the event. And if it occurs at the event, have a moderator who is ready to pivot and just say, sort of as a reminder, we're, a nonpartisan organization, and move on to the next thing. But I think the sort of someone going off script at an event is not something I view as likely to lead to any organizational liability. So let's next touch on a very important distinction between issue advocacy on the one hand and political campaign intervention on the other. So charities, and this sort of must be true, right? This is kind of critical to what many organizations are trying to accomplish. Charities are permitted to take positions on public policy issues, including issues that divide candidates in election for public office, which, as we all know today, is many, many, many public policy issues. But 501c3 organizations must avoid engaging in issue advocacy that functions as political campaign intervention. So you can't speak to an issue as with the intent of affecting people's views about a particular candidate. So let's explore that a little bit more with, again, a sort of all of the facts and circumstances test. And Noah, let's just go ahead and get all of these up. So in considering whether a particular communication is permissible issue advocacy or prohibited political campaign intervention, IRS guidance sort of elucidates a list of factors that should be considered. Those are laid out here in the interest of making the best use of everyone's time today, and knowing that we will leave this with you as a takeaway resource. I'm not going to read every word that's up on this slide. I've highlighted a few in particular that I think are the most important. Those are whether the statement makes reference to voting or an election. It should not do so. It should focus solely on the issue at hand and the organization's views on it. Whether the issue is one that distinguishes candidates for office, that's sort of, we're only in this world of needing to distinguish between the two if that's the case. But point being, if you're advocating an issue that isn't an issue at stake in an election, then you don't need to be concerned about these rules. You may, to preview the second half of our discussion today, need to think about whether you're engaged in lobbying activity. But unless they divide candidates for office, it's not going to be, speaking to those issues does not run the risk of being treated as campaign intervention. The last factor that I really want to highlight, and I think is, in my view, the most important is whether the communication is part of an ongoing series of communications by the charity on the issue, independent of the timing of any election. So if you're an organization that regularly advocates for broadened access to arts education for New York City youth, and you regularly issue communications about that goal, you don't need to stop doing that just because that issue has suddenly entered the public discourse and is something that rival candidates for a public office are debating over. You can continue communications in that vein up to and through the election. You should refrain from, again, referring to the election, or and those issue advocacy communications should continue to be nonpartisan. But you can be comfortable that they won't be treated as implicit endorsements of one particular candidate, so long as they're part of a regular pattern and practice of those communications. Where organizations can get themselves into trouble is taking up an issue for the first time once it has become a key issue of debate between candidates for office, because then you don't have that history, that pattern and practice of communicating on this issue, and it appears to a reasonable outsider that you've just taken up this issue because it is now the one that may settle the outcome of it, one that is being considered in connection with the outcome of the election. That's not a hard and fast rule. It doesn't mean under no circumstances can an organization take up issue advocacy for the first time in proximity to an election where it's a divisive issue. But I would say that's one to proceed with caution and after sort of careful consideration of some of these other factors. So let's go to the next slide. I mean, again, just reiterating the key considerations: a non-electoral purpose, past pattern and practice, and one I didn't mention on the preceding slide. It is very helpful when advocating for an issue that may be an issue of current debate between candidates for office, that there be a sort of good record about the organization's goals and impact in making the communication. So develop the materials with an eye towards educating the public, and not with discussion about the particular election.
Okay, moving on to lobbying. So we'll get into the specific definition of lobbying shortly, but as a kind of background matter, if you are a 501c3 organization, no substantial part of your organization's activities may consist of lobbying. So put another way, if you're a public charity, you may only engage in an insubstantial amount of lobbying. And again, with the kind of facts and circumstances refrain, generally insubstantial here is interpreted on a facts and circumstances basis. There isn't a particular clear threshold for how much lobbying is too much lobbying, or how much lobbying puts your tax exempt status at risk. There is an exception here where if you're a public charity other than, I think, a church, you can elect to be treated under the what's called the expenditure test described in Section 501H of the Federal Tax Code. And this basically provides you with a kind of specific dollar amount of lobbying expenditures that you are permitted to make based on the annual amounts that you're spending directly in furtherance of your charitable purposes. So the more you're spending on charitable programs, the more you're permitted to lobby or spend on lobbying. The thing to know about this rule is there is an absolute maximum or a cap of $1 million placed on lobbying expenses, and that's applicable to organizations who are making exempt purpose expenditures greater than $17 million. So if you happen to be a very large organization, you might prefer the facts and circumstances test, because it could be possible for you to argue that more than $1 million in lobbying expenses is quote unquote insubstantial, considering kind of the full scope of your organization's activities. And this final point on the slide is perhaps a little bit less relevant for those of you in attendance, but just for background, if you are a private foundation, which is another type of 501c3 organization that receives a little bit less of its kind of funding from the general public, you are not permitted to lobby at all. And if you do so, you will be subject to kind of penalty excise taxes on your lobbying expenditures. So that's kind of broadly the federal tax regime around lobbying. And now we'll get into kind of what is lobbying. So pretty technical definition set forth in the tax code. Lobbying means attempting to influence specific legislation by a legislative body. And we're going to take each of these elements in turn. So legislation, of course, refers to bills and resolutions, but also includes confirmation votes on nominees put forth by the executive branch, treaties, also includes referenda, ballot initiatives, or constitutional amendments that are voted on by the public. When we talk about legislative bodies, we're thinking about Congress, also state legislatures, city councils, town councils, any kind of similar governing bodies with legislative powers. Legislative bodies can also refer to the general public in their capacity as voters on a referenda, ballot initiatives, and constitutional amendments. The definition of legislative bodies excludes any executive offices like the governor's office, excludes the judicial branch of government, so the courts, and also excludes any administrative agencies like the EPA or the National Endowment for the Arts. On specific legislation, you want to be thinking about, of course, legislation that has been already introduced in a legislative body, but this definition also includes specific legislative proposals that your organization might support or oppose. So this one can be a little bit slippery, I find. So definition of specific legislation, it's going to be narrower than just like any kind of proposed solution to any problem, but it is going to be broader than a bill that has been formally introduced or proposed in Congress, for example. So, if there's a detailed legislative proposal, even if it's not presented in the form of draft legislation or a draft bill, that could be captured in the definition of specific legislation. And things to kind of keep an eye on are, the level of specificity of the proposal, and also kind of the frequency of engagement with what can be regarded as a legislative body. Those are two sort of factors that tend to tip proposals kind of further into the specific legislation space. And then finally, attempting to influence means contacting or, as we'll discuss on the next slide, urging the public to contact members of a legislative body for the purpose of proposing, supporting, or opposing specific legislation. So if you are attempting to influence the outcome of a specific legislative proposal by affecting the opinions of the general public, this falls within the definition here. Kind of issuing communication saying things like contact your senator today about XYZ bill or initiative would be attempting to influence a specific piece of legislation within the meaning of lobbying here. And turning it over to Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Noelle. So I'm going to talk about direct versus grassroots lobbying. There's two reasons that we do this. The first, and where these definitions come from, is that if you are a 501c3 organization that has made the 501h election that Noelle referred to, in other words, says we're gonna keep track of every dollar we spend and every FTE of staff time we allocate to lobbying activities and report it on our 990. And so long as we stay below a particular dollar threshold, we know that our lobbying amount is permissible. If you make that election and choose that approach rather than sort of the general amorphous facts and circumstances test, then the reporting you're required to do on your 990 requires you to report two types of lobbying: direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. So that's the source of these definitions, but it is also the best way to understand the kind of two big buckets of activities that you can engage in that may constitute lobbying, and what is required to be present in each situation in order for it to constitute lobbying. So direct lobbying means a communication either with a legislator or with a member of a legislator staff or someone else kind of in the congressional type of ambit who is directly involved in the preparation of the legislation. And it's any communication with those individuals that refers to specific legislation and reflects a view on the specific legislation. So, for example, a letter to Senator Dent asking him to vote no on SB 42 is a direct lobbying communication because it's a communication with a legislator that refers to specific legislation and reflects a view on that legislation. Grassroots lobbying is where you are not communicating directly with a legislator, but rather with the general public. And if you're communicating with the general public, then the communication, in order to constitute lobbying, it must refer to specific legislation and reflect a view on the legislation. So the same components as you talked about with direct lobbying. But it must also include an additional component, which is a direct or indirect call to action for the member of the public to undertake some action regarding the specific legislation. So, so keep in mind that when you are speaking to a legislator, it is easier to lobby. All you have to do is mention a bill and what your view on it is. When you are communicating with the public, it is a higher bar for a communication to be treated as lobbying and requires this additional call to action step. So as another example here, a billboard that reads HB 22 is bad for families, so why is Congressman Yossarian supporting it? That can be a grassroots lobbying communication. So in the context of that second bucket, communications to the general public, we have this additional requirement of a call to action, and a call to action can be direct or indirect. And I realize we're sort of layering definitions within definitions, and that this technical kind of breaking out a piece of this can be confusing, but just remember that these are the things that if you want to avoid lobbying, you cannot do in a communication with the general public. So what's direct encouragement for purposes of a call to action? It means any statement that the recipient should contact a legislator or an employee of a legislative body. It includes stating the address, telephone number, or similar information of a legislator. It also includes providing a petition or tear-off postcard or similar material. In other words, either directly encouraging, telling them they should go contact a legislator, or providing them with pretty much the direct means for them to do so. Here's their name and address, or here's a postcard you can fill out yourselves. Indirect encouragement means merely identifying a legislator who's opposed to the communication, as being undecided about the legislation, as representing the recipient of the communication in the legislature, or as being a member of the legislative committee that will consider the legislation. So this doesn't provide the means of communication, but it sort of clearly identifies the person who the recipient is would be expected to contact. So it's sort of an implicit, like, here's who to reach out to if you feel strongly about this issue. That's sufficient to be indirect encouragement and constitute a call to action, such that a communication to the general public can qualify as grassroots lobbying. I will just very briefly mention there's a sort of special exception if there's highly publicized legislation and the communication is a paid mass media advertisement. There's a lower bar. Effectively, like, if everybody knows that the Inflation Reduction Act is up for a vote next week, effectively any mass television communication that is sort of clearly about that topic is likely to be treated as a lobbying communication if everybody knows the issue that's being debated. I don't want to go through the requirements here in detail again, because I want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions, but just know that there's sort of this special situation if you're running a television ad or a newspaper ad and there's a big vote in Congress next week that everybody knows about, special rules apply.
So we thought it might be helpful to run through kind of a few fact patterns or concrete examples of common activities that may not be considered lobbying. So first off, public education or advocacy. Charities are permitted to educate, inspire, try to motivate the public to respond to a particular social problem without that being considered lobbying, provided that the kind of the pieces, the components of lobbying are not present. So as long as your efforts to educate and mobilize the public do not contain a call to action, direct or indirect, about a specific piece of legislation, that would not constitute lobbying. As we've discussed before, when thinking about lobbying, we're really concerned about advocacy directed towards legislative bodies, not executive, judicial, or administrative bodies. And charities are also permitted to engage in nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, which means independent and objective exposition of a particular subject matter, which may include any educational activities that are part of your organization's charitable program. And this nonpartisan analysis, study, and research, kind of in connection with this, you are permitted to advocate for a particular position or viewpoint, provided that you're kind of giving kind of a sufficiently fulsome explanation of the subject matter at hand, such that a reader could kind of reasonably come away from the materials and with their own sort of kind of independent opinion or conclusion. Something to note about the first and the third here, so public education or advocacy and nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, is that, if you were to turn around and kind of subsequently attach like a call to action to these educational materials or this research, that could make these materials be considered as lobbying if you sort of recast them kind of in sort of a lobbying kind of manner. So that's something to be aware of, subsequent uses of materials that might start out initially as public education or research materials. A few more kind of fact scenarios. So examinations and discussions of broad social, economic, and similar problems. These are also permissible, not necessarily treated as lobbying, even if these problems that are being discussed are of the type that you might expect a governmental body to kind of deal with ultimately. So you can even sort of express a discussion about some kind of broad social or economic problem, say that the legislature should do something about it, and that wouldn't constitute lobbying as long as you're not suggesting specifically what the content of the legislation should be. Second, response to request for technical advice. So sometimes a governmental body, committee, or subdivision will go out to interested organizations that have a particular expertise in the subject matter of a bill or proposal and ask for technical advice. You are permitted to provide that technical advice without that constituting lobbying. Just note that you would expect the request for advice to come from the body at large and not from a particular individual member of the requesting body. And then finally, there's an exception for what we call self-defense lobbying. So if there's a bill or a proposal that would have implications for the function of your organization, for your organization's tax exemption, for your organization's existence, powers, or obligations, you are permitted to communicate with the legislative body that's considering the act without that constituting lobbying. And it's kind of understood that you're doing it in the interest of your organization.
Before we move on, I just want to reiterate two points that Noelle mentioned. The first is on the technical advice lobbying. That invitation is coming formally and from the full committee who's requesting your technical advice. There are a lot of ways you might be asked by a legislator who's on a committee to sort of weigh in on a bill. That it's not a general exception for requests from involved legislators. This is like a very formal, please come testify before the Ways and Means Committee letter to you on Ways and Means letterhead. So I think that exception is narrower than it first may seem. Similarly, and also to emphasize sort of the somewhat narrow nature of these, self-defense lobbying, not necessarily narrow, but I just want to be clear, self-defense lobbying does not include funding, advocating for funding, or even advocating against reductions in funding. This is more like we are changing the rules for at the federal level, 501c3 organizations generally, or within New York State, the governing rules for organizations formed under the not-for-profit corporations law, not just budget appropriations. So I think this is another one I'm inclined to just mention in passing. We've talked a lot about 501c3 organizations, aka charities. There are also 501c4 organizations. There are 501c lots of other things organizations, but I think likely in this group, the other category of 501c entity you are likely to encounter is 501c4s. 501c4 organizations are permitted to engage in an unlimited amount of lobbying so long as it is in furtherance of their social welfare purposes, and are permitted to engage in political campaign intervention in furtherance of their social welfare purposes, so long as political activity is not their primary activity. So in brief, 501c4s have a lot more flexibility to engage in lobbying and political campaign intervention. However, contributions to 501c4 organizations are not tax deductible by the donors. That's the key distinction between the treatment of C3s and C4s. Many C3 and C4 entities exist as part of parallel structures, and so organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council, the National Rifle Association, Planned Parenthood, who have both sort of charitable educational activities and also have broader sort of public policy, social welfare goals, operate C3 and C4 entities in parallel. That is something to be very, very careful about, to make sure that the separate existence, nature, and most importantly, funds of those organizations are respected. But I just wanted to kind of, address how C4s fit into this picture. They're often part of the public dialogue, and there's something that you may encounter. It's possible some folks on the phone have partner C4 organizations, or you may work with organizations who do.
And then just, in case all of that wasn't enough to think about, Kevin and I wanted to just flag a few other rules kind of adjacent that you might want to be on the lookout for. So first, as Kevin previewed at the onset of the presentation, we have set forth kind of the political advocacy and lobbying rules under federal tax law and the implications of those rules for the federal tax exemption of your organizations. But federal, state, and local governments also have their own separate registration and reporting requirements for both individuals and organizations that lobby. These requirements vary across jurisdictions, and we're not going to can't, for purposes of this presentation, go into all the variations there, but just as a general note, want to flag that oftentimes the scope of activities that is covered by these registration and reporting requirements is broader than kind of what we've described exists under federal tax law. So for example, the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which is a federal law, includes within the definition of lobbying efforts to influence regulation as well as legislation. So to the extent that you decide to engage in some quantity of lobbying, and an insubstantial quantity of lobbying, this is something to be aware of as well, sort of how these other regimes might impact what you are able to do. We've listed here some kind of follow-up materials that you can reference later on your kind of on your own time that lay out some of these registration and reporting requirements. In addition, we want to flag that oftentimes public officials are subject to a variety of public ethics laws. Of particular relevance are some of those laws that are related to whether or not public officials can accept gifts and other types of payments from lobbyists. So for example, in New York State and in New York City, the rules are slightly different, but as a general matter, lobbyists aren't, or public officials aren't permitted to receive from lobbyists gifts of more than a nominal value. In New York State, at least, that's gifts of $15 or more. The laws are can be a little bit complicated. Sometimes they capture, family members of public officials as well as the officials themselves. So something to be aware of to the extent your organization is looking to provide things of value, whether material or kind of a benefit like going to an event to public.
Yeah. And I think the practical takeaway here, because there are regimes, most of these regimes are focused on the conduct of the public officials and prohibit them from accepting the gifts. There are some rules that apply to registered lobbyists and prohibit them from offering gifts, but they prohibit them from offering gifts in an attempt to influence the decision-making of the recipient. So as an organization in this space, without suggesting this is kind of, you may find yourselves in situations where you need a deeper understanding of these rules, but I'd say a good rule of thumb for these is never make a gift with an attempt to influence someone's decision-making, right? Like, I mean, that's we're starting to talk about bribery. So I think like the intention in offering something to a public official should be, for example, like the offering a come to this event at our school, we want you to attend. There may be other situations like that where it's otherwise would be a general member of the public would need to pay to purchase a ticket, where you may say, oh geez, like I'm not trying to do anything untoward, but I want to offer this to our local city council member. What do I do? What I would suggest in that situation is call the council member's office, say we would like to offer them an invitation. We don't know if he or she is permitted to accept it. Can you give us some guidance? Because the liability and risk here is on one, the public officials, and two, on registered lobbyists who are making these offers with sort of not bad intentions might be strong, but like an attempt to influence the public officials' decision making. So if you're outside of those two categories, I would just generally encourage you to communicate with staff and make sure that you aren't putting the public official into a position where it's awkward for them to need to sort of decline or disclaim something. So we had as our last scheduled topic a few points to make about social media. I think I'm just debating whether I should. We still have 12 minutes left, so let me make these, I think, quickly, and then we'll turn over to questions. I mean, I think the point, and again, some of this came from questions that were provided in advance of this session. The first thing I'd say is there's no special social media exception. A social media communication is a communication subject to the lobbying rules, and if the communication otherwise meets the definition of lobbying, whether it's direct or grassroots lobbying, a communication on social media will be treated the same as any other communication. One like footnote to that, or sort of thing to think about, is the costs of a broadly disseminated social media communication are likely much, much lower than the old days. I mean, not the old days, this is still done, but than printing and distributing flyers, right? So if you are, you are a 501c3 public charity permitted to engage in an insubstantial amount of lobbying, then a social media post that constitutes lobbying is likely to be a very, very small drop in the bucket of that insubstantial part of your activities. Please don't take that to say, and so therefore go do all the social media lobbying you want. Your social media lobbying will never reach the threshold of substantial. That's not my definitely not my legal advice. But just making the point that if you are an organization who the primary activity, destination of all your expenses, your activities, your staff are focused on delivering programs in your program area, and you occasionally weigh in on a bill, the occasional weighing in on a proposed piece of legislation on social media is not something that will tip you over from permissible into impermissible territory. Consistent with the point that social media communication is a type of communication, atting, or that's at with the a with the loop, atting or tagging or whatever platform specific methodology is available to ensure that your post is brought directly to the attention of a particular elected official, our advice is to treat that as a direct communication with that legislator. So if you say at Senator Schumer in a social media post about a piece of legislation and you reflect a view on that legislation, that is a direct lobbying communication. And you don't, it doesn't matter whether or not we know if he reads his direct ats or not. If you've sort of tagged the legislator or staff member into your post, treat that as a communication with them, as well as a communication with the general public. I will just quickly hit a few other things to think about on the internet and on social media. So you're sharing communications issued by others. That is a communication by you. Others sharing your communications is a communication by them. So if someone else posts a communication that's a lobbying communication and you share it on your channel, you have now made a lobbying communication. If you have posted a non-lobbying communication and someone shares that and says at the top, see, this is why City Council Bill XYZ must be passed or defeated as applicable, that communication by them is a lobbying communication, but you're not responsible, absent some prior coordination or agreement. You're not responsible for their separate use of your social media post. If you maintain a web forum or other similar venue where individual users can make posts, generally, we would take the position that posts by individual users in those contexts should not be attributed to the organization, even if the sort of forum is branded. It is a good practice to use disclaimers in that situation to make clear that people who are permitted to post there are posting in their individual capacity. These are not the communications of the organization. If you do moderate content, if you have a policy to sort of remove political content, consistently enforce it. In some ways, I think, not in some ways, I think that you are better off with no moderation and clear disclaimers that sort of everything goes, this is not the organization's communications, and no political content moderation, than inconsistently applied political content moderation that may seem partisan in one direction or another. Last but not least, and in some ways maybe the question we get the most in this context is, what social media communications are attributable to the organization? And so any official organizational accounts, I think that's the easy one, right? Any official organizational accounts are clearly a communication by the organization. However, it is often the case that you may have individual staff members who post both organizational communications and personal communications to a single social media profile. We don't tell organizations that they need to prohibit their staff from individual political communications. That's clearly something we want to avoid, policing the speech of staff. But if you have staff who post sort of institutional and personal communications on a single social media feed, first, try to avoid that situation if you can. Organizational accounts are always better. But if you can't, then make sure that individual has sort of a permanent disclaimer on their account that the views expressed on that account are their own, or that they're sort of identified as such on a post-by-post basis. Very senior leaders of organizations, it's sometimes a very tough call. Again, would not provide as legal advice that like the CEO of an organization needs to refrain from expressing individual political views or views on legislation, but it is harder for them to disclaim their organizational role than it may be for some others. And some organizational leaders choose to limit or refrain from like public discourse on politics and lobbying for that reason. So that's it for the content we wanted to cover. I went off on social media a little longer than I intended, so I've only left us 5 minutes, but very happy to speak to anyone's questions, and happy to run a few minutes over 5 if we have enough questions. I did not see any in the chat, but I don't know if that's because I just can't, they're not visible to me.
I didn't see anything come through in the chat either, but folks, I welcome you. If you have questions, you can put it in the chat. You're also welcome to raise a hand, come off of mute, and pose your question like that as well. Carrie, I see your hand. Hi.
Hello, Carrie speaking. I'm from the Teaching Artists Guild, which is a national nonprofit. So oftentimes I'm working with teaching artists based in states outside of New York State. So I understand that this question might not be particular for this context. In terms of grassroots lobbying, oftentimes we give workshops with other organizations that have very clear political views, like Black Lives Matter at schools or Zin Education Project, or we might be working with in a state where certain books are banned. And so the teaching artists are having to negotiate their curriculum or find a way to edit their lesson planning so that they can do in that school, or they're fired because of their sexual orientation. So I'm wondering, as a 501(c), is it grassroots lobbying to present a workshop connected to Black Lives Matter at schools, or to provide resources for teaching artists who identify in a certain way, but they are banned from certain state laws or to work?
Yeah. So let me take this the second one. Let me take the second one first, because I do not think that workshops that provide advice to LGBTQ identified teaching artists about here's how to think about navigating environments where revealing your identity may cause your termination. That is not political campaign intervention or lobbying. State laws in some of these areas are getting more insane by the day. And so in the women's health space, for example, I just would say, and I try in my practice, this is, the personal views of Kevin Rowe and not the advice of Simpson Thatcher. Like, I seek to facilitate organizations. You are mission-driven organizations, and I want to empower you to engage in your missions. I think it's important to be aware that there are states that are passing laws that purport to reach outside of the state and penalize organizations for engaging in conduct that state legislators disapprove of in that state. The first thing we learn in civil procedure in law school is about, like, states aren't really allowed to do that. You can't go punishing people in New York because you're in Texas and you don't like what they're doing in New York. That's being tested in courts, being felt out. I think, like, different organizations have different risk tolerances, and you should be in communication with your peers about what they're doing about those things. So with that caveat of who knows what sort of outside 501(c)(3) punitive legislation state legislatures may pass that I think are of arguable, questionable constitutionality, that's not, for federal law purposes, political campaign intervention or lobbying. Only once you say, we think the rule should change, here's how to go change it, or telling people in that state to take action to change it, that's when you step into the lobbying and political campaign intervention.
Does action mean providing resources? Like, here are organizations in your state that are, if you're looking for help about it, like providing, contacts, or just other resources, other organizations that are there in your state. Is that active?
I don't think so. I would not treat that as lobbying. I mean, you could imagine some, like, wink and nod, like, here's organizations that are doing the lobbying, but even then, unless you're sort of actively engaged in recruiting people for the purpose of directing them to an organization that's engaged in lobbying, I would not treat that as lobbying. So I know we're right at 5. Like I said, I have probably 5 or 10 more minutes to hang out. Let's call it 7 more minutes to hang out. If that's okay, Kinsey, I shouldn't presume we can hijack the Zoom, but if
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. But if people need to drop, please feel free, and we don't take it personally. Yeah, so budgets, we get this all the time. There's no budget exception to the lobbying rules, and the budget that gets passed by city council is a piece of legislation. And so communicating with city council about the budget, or communicating with the public, encouraging them to contact the city council about the budget, will be lobbying activity. There are two kind of situations where I think that it can be a little different. So sometimes there's block allocations to city agencies, and the subdivision of those budgets by city agencies is vested in the commissioner of DYCD. Talking to the commissioner of DYCD about how they allocate their budget within their permitted envelope is okay, and how they design an RFP process to select recipients of particular budget lines, that's all okay. But the actual anything that's going to be reflected in the actual piece of legislation that gets passed is going to constitute lobbying. There's another exception we get asked about sometimes, and this is where you need a veteran city lobbyist, but it has been the case that city council members have discretionary funding to allocate to C3s in their districts. I don't exactly know that process, but we've generally been of the view that if your city councilor has the discretion to kind of support local organizations, that kind of communication with the city councilor about their funding that's within their purview, individual purview, not the sort of legislative piece of legislation, is different. I don't know if that's still the case, but that was my understanding of city council funding from recent discussions. Just reading this question, make sure I answered all aspects of it. Yeah, so I think unfortunately, Deborah, that just identifying, with respect to the 2024 budget cycle is sufficient to be identifying the piece of legislation. Although I will say, let me clarify that. A general communication that there should be more funding for the arts, broader support for the arts, I would not say constitutes lobbying. And I would say that does not constitute lobbying, because I don't think that constitutes specific legislation. You're not saying it about a particular budget cycle. You're not saying it about a particular change to the proposed legislation or a dollar amount or anything like that. It is just generally advocacy that arts and education should receive more financial support from the city, state, federal level. I think those communications can fall outside the definition of lobbying. That's a bit in the gonna depend, be a bit of a communication by communication consideration, but I just wanted to make clear that I'm not saying that generally we should provide more funding for arts education is not necessarily a lobbying communication.
Hi, I have a quick question. No, there's no for questions. Yeah, so in terms of issue advocacy, or I was wondering about sort of semantics, I guess, is just sort of is the range of advocacy activities that nonprofits are permitted to engage in, inclusive of activist activities like marches or rallies. Because I'm thinking, in the arts space, there are a lot of artists that work at that intersection, right, of activism and arts. And there are times where activism is part of their artistic practice. I've certainly worked with a lot of artists that work at that intersection. And, I guess, what I'm really wondering is just sort of, to what extent are nonprofits sort of allowed to support that work at that kind of intersection, right? Can we directly engage, or does it need to be within a secondary capacity, supporting capacity?
So I mean, I think to supporting an activity is not really distinct from engaging in the activity for purposes of these rules. If you are supporting another person's lobbying, if the organization is supporting another person's lobbying, that the time and effort and expense put into that support is itself considered like a lobbying expenditure. But I think rallies and protests and that sort of thing, I think it is some are participation in some would constitute political campaign intervention or constitute lobbying, and participation in others would not constitute political campaign intervention or constitute lobbying. So if it's a, March on Albany for, again, for support of arts education, and it's if it's, let's say it's off cycle with the budget, right? Like it is just a general, like it's National Arts Education Day, and so we are going to line up outside the Capitol in support of broader funding and other forms of governmental support for arts education. I don't think that's a lobbying activity, and so staff participation and staff support of participation by others in that rally would not constitute lobbying. But if it's defeat bill XYZ, then facilitation and support of that would be. And if it's defeat candidate A or elect candidate B, that's political campaign intervention and should not be something that a 501c3 is facilitating in any way. Did that address your question? Or I realize there's this also like intersection with some of it is kind of artistic expression, and I'm not sure if I quite reached that question. So if there's a more specific hypothetical I didn't address, let me know.
Yeah, no, thank you for that that response. I guess I'm also wondering on the flip side, what if you're not naming a specific legislative policy or kind of person in office? You're not trying to like call them out. You're just trying to address a broad issue. Like someone early in the conversation mentioned, Black Lives Matter. It's Black History Month. And a lot of people address that. Working in the artivist space, that would be something I think a lot of people would address.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's one where I don't think that it's a little. I would argue that like the organizational endorsement and attendance at rallies of Black Lives Matter is not lobbying or political campaign intervention, because although Black Lives Matter, the movement and organization, has as part of its goals like political positions and positions on legislation, it also has a non-political, non-lobbying message about the fact that Black Lives Matter and what that means. And you can I think that endorsement of the organization can reasonably be done without that constituting campaign intervention or lobbying. But I think any sort of organizational support of that, I would advise you be careful to make sure that it is framed as support of the mission, of the values, and not of its, specifically of any of its like particular like legislative or political positions.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that distinction. I think that was essentially, what I was trying to get at, that fine line between naming like a person or a bill directly versus supporting a broader movement or coalition or set of values.
Yeah. So are op-ed pieces written by staff members considered lobbying? And I think this should probably be the last question we take as we come up here on 510. So if it's disclaimed as written in their individual capacity, no. So if a staff member is going to write an op-ed as an individual, they can publish it under their own name, but should include a statement that it reflects their personal views and not the views of the organization. I would say it depends. You could also, depending on the context and the individual, simply not name the organization and just have them write it in their personal individual capacity. But if they want to be identified by title, or the paper wants to identify them by title, it should make clear that it's an individual opinion. I mean, I should also say, like, the op-ed would need to otherwise constitute lobbying, right? And so because it's an op-ed, it's not directly a communication with the legislator. And so if it does not include a call to action, which is actually quite easy to do effectively in an op-ed, you just sort of can't name the individual legislators or encourage anybody to contact a legislator, but you can say, here's this bill, here's why it's bad, or here's why it's good, in an op-ed without being engaged in lobbying.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin, and thank you both again for staying a little over to answer these great questions. So I think to close out, I'm going to turn it back to Kinsey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin and Noelle, for your time and expertise. I know it's a lot of dense information for some folks to get through, so being here with you and you answering questions and just walking us through all this information is so incredibly helpful. We're really grateful to you. And thank you so much, Patricia, for being here, and to the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest for partnering with the Roundtable on this event. And lastly, of course, thank you all for joining us. I will be sending a follow-up email with resources and a link to the recording and all of that good stuff, but you can always feel free to reach out if you have questions, or want to be guided to some resources or contact information about our facilitators or the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. I also just want to share a quick invitation to join us at an in-person event that is coming up at the Roundtable on February 22nd. We'll be at Recess Art in Brooklyn for an artist salon. It's going to be a really lovely evening full of art and community, and so we'd love for you to join us there if you can. You can find more information and register at the link in the chat. And with that, I will sign us off. Thank you all again so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.